It would be very logical to ask, well, what's happening here? What is this app.use? And one of the things I'm going to find out about Express is Express is really this pipeline. We've just been basically handling our requests, either slash or get or post. But the fact is that a request can actually go through multiple pieces of middleware. And this is a piece of middleware. And what this is saying is, hey, look, we're not setting this up for any route in particular, but we want to call this function when a request ends up coming in. So all of these apps.use, apps.get, this would be part of what we would call the Express pipeline. And we'll find out the order ends up mattering here, and that's why we're putting this up at the top. But rest assured, if we go over here and we console.log, express.json, anything that is in an app.use or anything, if we have a get and we specify this, anything that's after this over here, this is actually going to be a function. And if we go and we log it, we'll see, hey, this is a function, right? It's actually telling us, got a name, JSON parser. And if we wanted to log it to string, we'll actually see the function that's coming in here. And rest assured, look at it. It has that signature that we have in all of our routes, request, response, next. And one thing you should be aware of is that what's going to happen is that this function is going to end up getting called. At some point, it's going to end up either calling next with nothing or calling next with an error. But what's interesting about this is that, this is middleware. We could put our own, and we verified that this works, right? Because we were able to actually create the user with it. Without it, we weren't able to do it. We could put our own middleware here by doing an app.use and putting a function here. But we're going to run into a real problem here. If we end up putting this function here, and we end up running our application, we'll find out that we're just going to end up spinning forever. So once we end up going into the Express pipeline, again, we set up the pipeline, although we don't call these callback functions. It's up to us when we go into this pipeline at some point to call next. Once I do that, we're going to be back in business just the same way that we were before. If I was to go over here and call next with something in here, then Express is going to say, well, you had an error here. If I look at this, I'll actually get a 500 response back here. So what this allows you to do is put in middleware, and in the case of the express.json middleware, it's looking at the request, it's looking for a request.body, and it's parsing that request.body so we could end up using it down here in this route. Again, if there's no request.body, it probably just ends up calling next. If it can't parse it, it'll end up throwing an exception. But something like this could be, pretty useful, because one thing you could do here is maybe you could console.log the request.url. But make sure if you do that, you end up calling next. And what do we do here? Well, now we have a little bit of logging middleware. We could end up writing out the URL that ends up getting called. We're back in business with our application. And if I go to my console, I'll see that whenever I end up calling anything here, and there's not a ton of things that I could end up calling. If I put in a new user here, I'll see that I ended up making a call to API users, and I could also go over here and not only display that, I could specify that I also want to console log the request.method, and I could even put this in you called, and we'll do the request.url, right? This is just a string. You called request.url as a, and this is going to be the request.method. And so we could do this, and as long as there's not an error here, we could refresh this. We'll see we called slash as a get, we called API users as a get, and we could go over here. And now we can see we called this as a post. So again, by having this middleware here, it really ends up making Express very extensible. we'll talk about different types of middleware, but we end up using them for things like logging. We end up using them for things like parsing out form data. And it really is very useful. So one thing to think about when you think about Express is to think about this pipeline. We start with the post request, at least. With all the requests, we start up here. And again, when we call next, we end up going down to the next one. And it's really up to us to decide what to do. Again, we didn't write this, so this is handled for us. But with this one, we logged out some information, and then we ended up calling next.